Thank you again, everyone, for logging on for today's webinar. We're just going to give it a few more seconds to let others come on, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm happy to introduce the WSSA President, Stanley Culpepper.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you guys for joining us for the 8th webinar in our series hosted by the WSSA and USDA ARS. It's a great opportunity to have you with us today. For those of you that have joined us before, welcome again. For those of you that are new, just so you have the background, we actually had Dr. Young and Dr. Duke submit a symposium for an annual meeting that was supposed to be in Canada this past February. Once we went virtual, unfortunately, we couldn't fit all the symposiums into our program. So that's how this webinar series came about. And it's worked out really, really well. And we want to thank you so much for your support in this process. Let's get started. I'm going to introduce Dr. Steve Young as your moderator. Steve is a weed scientist and the National Program Leader for Weeds and Invasive Pests at ARS. Steve, take it away.
Great, thanks, Stanley. Appreciate that. And again, I want to emphasize my thanks to WSSA for hosting this and providing this platform for us to really highlight some of the outstanding research at ARS on weed science. So just a reminder for those of you in the audience, we are going to have some time for Q&A today. So feel free to use the chat to put your questions in there or use the Q&A box. Either one works. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And again, don't wait till the end. Typically we get a big burst of questions, but if you got something, on your mind, you really want to ask it, feel free to put that in there. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker. So today we're going to hear from Dr. John Madsen. He's a research biologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, ARS, Invasive Species and Pollinator Health Research Unit. And that's located on the campus of UC Davis. Previously, he was a faculty member at Mississippi State University for 10 years and a research biologist with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. Dr. Madsen has a Bachelor of Science degree from Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, a Master's of Science and a doctor's degree in botany from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So John is slowly converted into weed science. We won't hold that against him, but very pleased to have him here talking to us today about the spread and distribution of invasive plants. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to go right into my talk here.
Yeah.
Pull this up. There we go. Can you all see that?
Looks good.
Good. Okay. My topic today is the spread and distribution of invasive plants. Actually, I'm talking about a broader topic than that. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the basics because there are a few weed scientists hiding out there. And whenever I go to particularly a university weed science group and talk where there are row crop people and everybody else, they grumble about why we have invasive plants as opposed to just weeds. Well, President Clinton in his executive order defined an invasive species as a non-native species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Well, that definition, other than the non-native species part, is one definition of what a weed is. A weed is a species that can cause economic or environmental harm. So this one term, invasive, in the case of invasive plants, combines both the concept of not from around here, which where Stanley is from would be a Yankee, but we're talking about plants here, and harm in one word. Therefore, an invasive plant is a non-native weed, but a weed may not necessarily be invasive based on this definition. There are plenty of native plants that can be weedy. Okay, so some of you saying, well, I didn't know ARS worked on invasive plants. Well, in fact, yes, they do. USDA ARS has numerous research projects on invasive pests, including agricultural and non-crop pests. USDA, for instance, is the lead federal agency on biological control of pests, most of which are invasive species. Although less than in the past, the USDA ARS also continues to pursue research on other control techniques, including herbicides. This talk, though, will focus on ecological studies and does not include the specifics of control techniques. While these will appear as disparate studies, and I'm not going to try and hide that, they are all focused on invasive plants in non-crop areas. How this talk has evolved as it is that I asked for contributions of slides from a number of my colleagues that work on ecological topics with invasive plants. And I appreciate my colleagues here who replied and sent me some slides. I'll just let you know that typically ARS scientists hate it when they get a request for a couple of slides. So it was very kind of them to do that. I'm not going to read their names right now. You can read them off yourself. Okay, so the first contribution from Dana Blumenthal, he's looking at the effect of nutrition on plant invasion, the invasion of an invasive species. And so he found that simulated nitrogen deposition promoted the invasion of one invasive plant species. He also looked at some data looking at manure application in an old field over several decades and found the longer you have those additions, the greater the invasion of this invasive plant. And in a tall grass prairie, nitrogen addition increased invasion of old fields. So just in general in grasslands, more nutrients means a better location for invasive plants to come in. What's interesting though, is in his research, he's found a way to counteract that effect, namely adding some form of carbon, whether it be sawdust or sugar or other, straw would work. And you can ameliorate that effect. You can make those nutrients not available to plants. His work now is looking at focused grazing, using cattle grazing early enough in the season to stop seed production in cheatgrass to control the long-term growth of cheatgrass communities. The next topic is looking at John Gaston's work with his group on the genetics of plant invasions. Answering some questions as what species is this invading? Where did this invasion come from? How is this invasive species related to other species? Are there any hybrids, and how do these plants spread? For instance, you can see that knowing where the invasion came from would be very helpful in seeking for the correct biocontrol agent to be introduced to control that species. The first plant he shared work on is flowering Russian. This is a plant that I'm familiar with. And what his work found, looking at a large number of samples from across North America, is that he had found 9 genotypes in this invasion. There are more genotypes in Europe, but he found these 9 in North America. And the predominance of populations in the western portion of the range are one genotype. That genotype is triploid. There are diploid genotypes, and some of those have invaded in the eastern portion of the US. Second weed he's worked on is mullein. And he found that 50% of invasive populations of this plant are monotypic. And he found only a total of 32 genotypes out of 431 plant sampled. This same genotype can be found across the range of invasion. And this is very odd when you have an obligate outcrosser. The origins of this plant are in Belgium, Germany, and France. Dr. Gasson and his colleagues have also looked at Crupina and found that there are 7 genotypes in the 17 populations they have sampled thus far. The reproduction in this plant is mostly by selfing. This is important because the proposed biological control agents they're working with are effective on different genotypes. So if you know what the genotype of a given population is, you can introduce the most effective biocontrol agent. His group has also worked on field bindweed. This is, in fact, one of the top 10 ag weeds worldwide. He's found 2 genetic lineages. And in those 2 lineages, there are almost 400 different genotypes. And there's a very distinct geographic distribution of these 2 lineages, where there's one genotype in the western part of the invaded range and one genotype found predominantly in the eastern part of the invaded range. I'm flying through this. Dr. Brenda Gruelle is the lead scientist on this current work plan and is looking at integrated weed management and restoration strategies for wetland and aquatic plant species. The goal of her work is to improve the understanding of biology and mechanisms that drive variation in invasive plant abundance, dispersal, colonization, and spread, and to advance a science-based development, improve integrated weed management techniques and restoration techniques for wetland and ecosystem recovery. This is through examining the accurate taxonomy and systematics of a invasive taxa, to use a functional plant trait response framework to examine how the plant responds in variations to environmental factors, especially in the context of which life stages are critical for invasion, and to develop ecological restoration and integrated weed management strategies. Dr. Gruel's group has worked on yellow flag iris and looked at its, she and her collaborators have looked at the effect of yellow flag iris on plant diversity in tidal wetlands within both its native and invaded ranges. In research in the California tidal estuary, and this is actually in the Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, she analyzed the impact of yellow flag iris on resident plant communities and found that the iris greatly reduced plant species richness and diversity in its naturalized California range. Whereas in examining yellow flag iris in its native Andalusia range, they found that the iris was associated with high plant species richness, evenness, and diversity. The impact of iris on native plant communities was only found in its invasive range. Dr. Gruel and her work and her group have also looked at seed bank, the importance of seed banks in invasive Ludwigia species. And she's looking at assessing the potential for seed bank recruitment that would then limit the recovery of native plant communities following disturbance. And their research indicates that the short-term weed control actions will likely be ineffective due to high numbers of weed species in seed banks, and that management actions need to be timed to prevent annual production of seeds so that the seed bank decreases rather than increases. This life stage, the formation of seeds in Ludwigia is the critical point to consider in trying to manage this species on the long term. So seed bank recruitment should be considered to improve restoration outcomes. Dr. Gruel's colleagues have also looked at the impact of salinity in invasive iris populations. And they found that while high salinity levels did decrease the rate of germination in iris, it does not completely preclude the germination of invasive iris. And after floating in seawater, the buoyant seeds, this is important because the seeds of iris are buoyant and will float for long enough to distribute to a new location and establish a new colony. So there's a potential for iris to colonize new sites following long distance dispersal. Dr. Gruel and her collaborators have also looked at the dispersal of Ludwigia in flowing river systems. And so that, for instance, they looked at the number and vigor of stem fragments in Ludwigia. Ludwigia, like a lot of aquatic plants, both submerged, emergent, and floating plants, if a stem segment breaks off, it can form new roots at the nodes, as you can see by the picture in the middle right, and that stem can establish a new colony. So in surveying for the number of stem fragments in the river, they sampled at upper, middle, and lower river cross sections. And they found that, that's the next slide, what they found is that the number of shoot fragments is not linear. It's greatest in the middle reach, and this is because that's where the highest total weed abundance is, and therefore has the highest propagule pressure, and it also is the site of the greatest anthropogenic disturbance. As well, they found that those fragments collected in the middle of the river were twice as long than fragments captured in the lower river and had more stem nodes. Since each stem node can root, that is essentially a potential viable propagule. So this supports the development of spatially targeted management to prevent the spread of these asexual propagules. And here's some of the work, some of the publications that have resulted from Dr. Gruel's research. Next, we'll move to looking at invasive annual bromes in a shrubland grassland ecosystem in northeast Wyoming. So looking at this map, let me just explain briefly that it's at the intersection of the sagebrush steppe that is predominant in that intermountain region in the west, which is very dry, and the Great Plains further east, which is predominantly grassland. So there's a mixture of shrubs and grasslands in this region. Now, you tend to, an ecology meeting or a weed science meeting, there will undoubtedly be discussions of the fire invasion feedback loop. It's been well documented in that Great Basin region. The presence of cheatgrass increases wildfire frequency and extent. Burn sites are more susceptible to further invasion, and more invasion, therefore, will lead to more fire. So it's really this positive feedback loop. And so her question is, does cheatgrass play the same role, the same game in this ecotone between grasslands and shrublands? Excuse me. This area has a different regime of rainfall, a different history of fire, and a different history of grazing. And she found first that historical wildfires were not associated with invasion. Burned areas had similar annual brome cover and less shrub cover than unburned areas. This work, by the way, I'm sorry, it's from Lauren Perensky. Secondly, she found that some grazing may help the system resist invasion. Long-term removal of grazing will cause an increase in the cover of annual bromes here and actually reduce native plant cover and diversity. So that means that this region functions more like the disturbance-adapted Great Plains then the sagebrush steppe that's further west. Disturbances like moderate grazing can actually help resist invasion in this ecosystem, and post-fire invasion is not a big concern. The grasslands have a long history of large grazers, so this is not necessarily a big surprise. Next, we have Natalie West and her work. She's working on weed biological control with insects and its dynamics and the population dynamics of weeds in an integrated weed management program in wild and rangeland systems. She's doing large-scale evaluations of weed populations and biocontrol impacts, and from this, developing an experimental evaluation of how plant demography interacts with this within the environmental context, with insect pressure, and with management strategies using common garden approaches, demography, seed addition plots, and other approaches. And she has a note on her continuing research where she's looking at weed-insect interactions and weed population dynamics to improve weed biological control systems. Next is the work by Carissa Wonka, who's a restoration ecologist in Sydney, Montana. And her research focus is to identify ecology-based restoration approaches for disturbed and degraded ecosystems, and to develop a community restoration and management approach that increases the efficacy of invasive plant control. She's looking at ecosystem processes that modulate that woodland encroachment and weed invasion into U.S. rangelands, and the utility of using plant functional traits for understanding plant community response to invasion. So I'm going to make a comment at this point. You may have noticed that some of these slides have a lot of stuff on them, and I don't blame my colleagues, okay? Because we get a call from management, I want 2 slides on your research. And when you ask for, I want 2 slides on your research, this is what you're going to get. You know, you're going to get, 4 slides on condensed to 1. So this is the system, so anyway, what Dr. Wonka has found is that in this grassland system, which is eastern Montana region, cheatgrass and Kentucky bluegrass were more commonly encountered in burned areas, but cover was lower. Kentucky bluegrass cover decreased with time since fire, but cheatgrass occurrence was higher in low to moderate severity burned areas than in unburned locations. Cheatgrass cover was lower in the very severely burned sites compared to unburned sites. So she's continuing her work on wildfire effects on creeping juniper, fire behavior simulation models to determine plant traits with high potential to slow fire spread, and other activities. She's also looking at restoration approaches to increase invasion resistance to weeds. And what's particularly interesting is she's looking at ecologically selected seed mixes to restore sites, as opposed to your commonly available native plant mix. So this is using ideas from two theories of community assembly. The first is you want a mix of species that are functionally similar to the invader, so that they act in the same manner as that invasive plant had, so that they compete. And the other thought is to make mixes of species with more competitive functional traits. Native plants that have higher photosynthetic rates or greater leaf mass per area, or other traits that might lead it to outcompete those invasive plant species. So she's using a multi-scaled approach, first examining these seed mixes in a small scale in a greenhouse, then moving to larger scale trials, and then finally to attempts to actually reclaim in actual reclaimed pipeline areas where they're measuring the plant physiological responses, and the idea is to reduce the spread of crested wheatgrass in each mixture. She's also looking at incorporating drought tolerance traits in the selection of seeds for restoration purposes. Finally, I feel I'm on safer ground here. I'm going to be talking about our work on invasive aquatic weeds. This is my work and a number of my colleagues, where we're working on submerged and floating invasive plants in the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta. And these projects were performed under these two project plans: the Watershed Scale Assessment of Pest Dynamics and Enhancing Water Resource Stewardship through Aquatic and Riparian Weed Management. It's also done as part of the Delta Region Area-Wide Aquatic Weed Project, or DROP. And DROP is the first area-wide project selected to examine the management of an invasive aquatic plant or plants in this system. So you might then ask, well, why is there an aquatic weed area-wide project in this system? The results of this area-wide project, by the way, are available in a special issue of the Journal of Aquatic Plant Management Society, which is available free at the APMS webpage. You can, if you like, you can just go to the apms.org and go to the journal link and then follow it. And you can see a special issue, and you can download those papers or look at which papers there are and see if there are any you're interested in. And I really want to thank ARS and the Aquatic Plant Management Society and the editor of the Journal of Aquatic Plant Management for enabling us to have this capstone to our area-wide project. And right now I'm trying to use more time, so. Okay, you asked, well, why in the world would there be an area-wide project on the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta? And I'll just call it the Delta, because everybody in California does. Well, first of all, it's the largest freshwater estuary on the West Coast. This is 68,000 surface acres of water within that red boundary line that stretches from Sacramento down to well south of Stockton, and from Stockton out to not quite to San Francisco Bay. It actually goes to Sassoon Marsh. And it provides irrigation water for 4 million acres of Central Valley cropland, which is kind of a big deal in the West. Habitat for 56 rare, threatened, or endangered species, so it makes it important in a regulatory sense. It is used for 2 million recreational boating trips a year. It's also used to carry cargo to the ports of Stockton and Sacramento, and is a very significant habitat for fish and wildlife. I was trying to say waterfowl, but all wildlife in the West. So the first topic will that of an ecological nature from drop is we looked at seasonal growth of plants, the phenology, and biomass distribution across the seasons. Actually, we looked at 3 species: water hyacinth, curly-leaf pondweed, and Agaricus densa. But I'm going to talk just about water hyacinth. And you can see that there's a very distinct seasonality of water hyacinth growth in the Delta. We of course sampled at 1 month intervals throughout 3 seasons, and we continuously recorded temperature in the water at those sample locations. So we could use the change in biomass in each time interval to calculate a relative growth rate of water hyacinth. And we can calculate an average water temperature across those 1 month intervals to look at how water temperature affects the relative growth rate of water hyacinth in the Delta. And this is all of the biomass data, both the ascendant limb in the spring and summer and the declining limb in the late fall and winter. And you can see that water temperature is very important in that relative growth rate. It also is interesting to note that there's an intercept at 18 degrees centigrade, which certainly corresponds to the behavior we see in the Delta. This is a subtropical species, and its growth really seems to accelerate as the temperature gets above 20 degrees centigrade in particular. We also looked at dispersal of water hyacinth. Water hyacinth will make these small mats that float free, and we would take a drogue that we made, and when I say I mean John Muscella, my technician. We took a poly bottle and painted it bright orange, and we put a recording GPS device inside of it. It's called a track stick, and we put another device in there that I'm not going to say what it is because my bosses, Steve Young, won't like it. I'll just tell you it because I'm almost retiring, but it's a dog collar that lets you know where your dog is. Okay, so people say, use a dog collar to track water hyacinth? Well, no, we actually use the dog collar to find our drogue when we were done. So we put these in the mat for 4 to 6 hours generally, and come back towards the end of the day and picked it up again. And you can see that we did a lot of drifts all over the southern part of the Delta. And what did we find? Well, we found a couple of very interesting things. The first is if you look at a regression first of plant direction versus the direction of water movement, which is predominantly tidal movement, the direction of flow with the tide explains the movement of water hyacinth mats much better than the direction of the wind. So the wind can blow very strongly in the Delta, but since the water itself is moving, that force is much greater than the force of the wind on the leaves. So that's the direction the plants move. The other thing we found is that the plant mats essentially just slosh around or seiche around. And you can see from this drift here that you place it in a point and they start moving out in this, or actually they move back in a bit, and then they move out as west, and then they move back in a ways. They're oscillating back and forth. The average amount of this oscillation is about a half a kilometer. The mats will frequently entrain on obstructions like the edge of the canal. And these canals are mostly riprap. So that's often where they get entrained. But then they'll float free for a significant period of time as well. So basically, in the absence of unusual circumstances, they slosh back and forth. Now, that being said, periodically there are events where you have very heavy river flow. We had such an event, I think it was 2019. We had a lot of late rain. This is when the dam eroded on the Oroville Reservoir, for instance, and the water just blew out of the delta to San Francisco Bay and carried a lot of water hyacinth with it. Our water hyacinth abundance were much less in the growing season of 2019 than they had been previously. And lastly, I'm sure you're all glad to hear me say lastly, we did some work with our colleagues at NASA to look at remote sensing. This is work with David Bubenheim and some of his colleagues at the NASA Ames Research Center, where we used first Landsat and later Sentinel data. Landsat data is a 30-meter resolution pixel. Sentinel is a 10-meter resolution pixel to map the locations of water hyacinth and Ludwigia together. We couldn't differentiate those two across a large portion of the delta. Now, some of you say, well, why are you using Landsat, which is much less, has a much lower resolution and a much fewer bands of spectral data. And there are two overriding factors. One is the cost. I mean, Sentinel and Landsat data are quite cheap to get. And if NASA has written a script to analyze it. So if you have that script, an agency can actually generate that the results of that data themselves, and they don't have to have the NASA, for instance, generated for them on a continuing basis. Whereas really high resolution sorts of satellites are quite costly. And the other reason is that Landsat and Sentinel data, we get data off of those satellites on about an every 3-week basis over the delta. So we can look at the abundance of these two floating aquatic weed species in the delta on 3-week intervals if it's cloudless weather, all across the growing season. And this is very helpful, not only in tracking the abundance, the general abundance of these weeds in the delta, and if they're growing and spreading, but also where are the locations those plants are coming from. And we call those nursery areas. So that's been very influential in developing management plans for floating aquatic vegetation to hit those nursery areas first and hardest, if at all possible. So with that, this is the time for questions. I may not be able to answer all those questions, but certainly we can direct questions to who might best answer them.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, John. That was really good.
Thank you.
I think the overarching kind of factors, and I've done a little research on this myself with invasive plants in the West and the Midwest, and looking at what is causing these plants to spread and distribute across these systems. And I think number one is a disturbance. There's got to be some kind of disturbance in the system, and when you have that, essentially you're creating a niche. You're creating a niche for something to move in. We know that nature doesn't operate in a vacuum. So when there's that disturbance, it allows for something to move in. And I think, what you've kind of highlighted really nicely is it's not a one size fits all. There's in each system, they each kind of operate their own way based on the ecology, based on the climate, based on the, anthropogenic influences. And so you put all that together, and sometimes, you do see, I'll just say, where you talked about grazing. Sometimes grazing is effective at reducing or keeping an invasive plant at bay, where other situations, like we worked in Nebraska, and we did work on cool season, warm season grasses. And we found that when those were grazed, sometimes excessively, it actually allowed for things like musk thistle and bull thistle and other kinds of thistles to really do quite well. And obviously cattle don't, consume those plants, but that's a different system with how things operate differently. So I think that's, one of the things to consider with that.
Yeah, well, I would broaden that, Steve. I'd say that it's when there's a change in the long-term regime, whether it be by disturbance or a change in the frequency of fire, a change in the frequency of flooding. It's that change that will also open a place for that species. In a lot of aquatic systems, if you stabilize water levels or raise water levels, that creates a thing for change. And yes, in terms of landscape management, that disturbance or change in regime is very important. But I think we also have to go back a bit and say, a big part of the problem is, where are these non-native plants coming from? They're coming into this country from other locations. And while with some pests, these pests are, hiding in materials that are being shipped, and that's true of a lot of the insects that are pest species. For plants, sadly, a lot of it is coming through either the nursery trade, or for aquatics, it's the water garden / aquarium trade. And this plant species they're picking are not well vetted. But the other thing is, a lot of the plants that are invading in North America, for instance, are cultivars of those plants from Europe. So they're not completely the same. They've been selected because they grow better in our country.
Yeah, and if
right from the native range.
And if you look globally, I mean, that's happening in other countries. It's not just, we're not just in North America, it's happening all over. So the other question is, so why is that? And some of the mechanisms that allow these invaders to flourish are really the key. And I think, there's been some research, not ARS related, but showing that I think it's like 10% of invasive plants that actually become a problem. It's only 10% of them. It's a very small percentage. And those 10% have found these conditions, whether it's accessing water in the soil, whether it's availability of light, whether it's looking at nutrients. Those things are allowing these plants to do well, regardless of how well we're keeping them out. So they're still able to do, establish themselves and flourish because of their ability to, invade and establish. So I think that's kind of the essence here is disturbance. You call it change. We've got climate change is impacting a lot of these systems as well, where drought and we've seen this in the West. We did some research looking at star thistle and how, native communities were able to kind of resist its invasion, but that all had to do with water. And so when we saw star thistle consume water across the profile, to very large depths, it actually shifted the whole trajectory of those communities towards star thistle, because the native grasses were slower in their consumption of water and how they operated. So again, it's really interesting to see these kinds of examples from different areas. We don't have a whole lot of questions, but we did have one on fire, and there's the difference between, we talk about wildfire and prescribed fire, and prescribed, and I've done some prescribed burning, and that's intentionally burning to control whatever vegetation in a specific area. It's well defined, it's well managed. A wildfire, it's out of control. You don't know where it's going to go. You don't know what it's going to do. So I think the question is asking, the difference between fire, the impacts of fire, wildfire versus controlled burn. Fire is fire. If you are able to control it versus letting it grow, go wild. I think there's going to be some differences. I don't know, anything that you ran across, John, and your other colleagues?
I'll give an opinion, but probably the best thing is to forward that to one of our scientists working on fire. And there are a couple of them that are working on the role of fire. But prescribed fires in the Southeast are used to manage the understories of longleaf pine. Mm-hmm. And they help keep the abundance of kogan grass down, which is an invasive grass. So fire can be good. But in the specific case of cheatgrass and the shrubland steppe of the Intermountain West, it's not a good relationship. Fire increases the growth of cheatgrass, and cheatgrass increases the frequency and severity of fire. So
yeah,
there's that, like a lot of life's questions are, well, that depends.
Right. Yeah. And there's, like you said, there's a whole team of ARS scientists working on fire and invasive annual grasses. So, and I just remind those in the audience, if you obviously there's questions, you can feel free to contact myself or John, and we can connect you to those that can give you, answers that would be specific to what you want to know. There's another question on early detection, and you mentioned this a little bit with your, identifying the aquatic invasive plants. It says early detection plays a significant role in invasive plant management in general. Is there any effective technology in place to help accomplish this? So you talked about satellite imagery, other things like, I don't know if drones come into the early detection kind of scenario, or there's the EDD, the early detection rapid response concept.
I'm really old, Steve. And let me tell you, EDR, I can't say it, early detection rapid response. And I have a history because Randy Westbrooks is the person who wrote the first manual for Fickmanu back in the last century. And he apparently was inspired by this idea at a meeting that I had invited him to in Poughkeepsie, New York, on Water Chestnut in 1990 something. And he is about to give his talk, and he says, "Do you have an overhead and some transparencies?" And I said, "Well, I have these Ziploc bags." And he wrote his talk on the Ziploc bags and took them back with him. And that's where EDR started. But as far as technology, again, I'm an old guy. So my opinions are a bit fixed about this, but I don't think there's a reasonable resolution and cost formula for using satellites for early detection per se. It could happen, you know, if we get to the point where we have a starship above, you know, in orbit above the Earth that can scan the whole globe, you never know. But right now, we're not there. However, there is a technology that's called environmental DNA detection. And I don't think it's particularly effective on plants, but I think it could be very effective on some animal species to detect their presence in a water body. But really, what's most effective technology for early detection and rapid response is a bunch of people looking. And making sure that we have good lines of communications between natural resource managers who know their systems and are interested, and know which plants are supposed to be there and which plants aren't. And that's still the most effective thing.
Yeah, that on the ground kind of ground truth thing is right. It's really effective. But I will say that the technology is getting there, especially if we move to our ag systems where it's a more concentrated, you know, view. We're getting better. So I could see that scaling up.
In ag, technology could do something there.
Yeah, I see that kind of scaling into these natural areas where there's more you know, hectares, more, you know, different plants that you don't know, you know, so well. But I think we're getting there, and I would say that's just something that's you know, being developed. So yeah, great. So I think, you know, with that, this is a topic, and I'll just, like you said, John, you know, again, this is specific to ARS, but this area, as I think most of our audience members would know, has been researched extensively by folks, you know, outside of ARS. So spread and distribution patterns, you know, whether you're talking about mapping, whether you're talking about mechanisms of how that happens, or whether you're talking about, you know, we haven't even touched on management, and that really wasn't the focus, because that's kind of for our last webinar, but it's a huge field, you know, and we didn't even touch on costs, you know, the cost of how these invasive plants, you know, what they're costing as far as their impacts on biodiversity, and then their cost to management. That's a real big question mark as well. A lot of people are trying to answer that one too, because you put a cost on it, and now we can say, well, this is more of a reason why we need to focus on it. So a lot of, you know, questions. Like I said, we could go on for a long time talking about spread and distribution, but it's a field that I think has a lot of potential for more studies. So, John, I know you keep referring to yourself as a older man, but you know, we still need folks like you, you know, working on this topic, because it's really important to our science, and trying to understand how does this develop into sustainable management of these systems. So I'd also encourage people to go to the APMS website that John mentioned. That's a fantastic number of articles in there on this aquatic invasive plant research project. So thanks, John, for bringing that up. Looks like Lee wants to make a comment here before we sign off for today.
It turns out we do need to be done by 3 o'clock, so thank you.
Excellent. All right. So with that, I'm gonna say thank you everyone for showing up again today. Next week, same time, same place, we're going to talk about climate change effects on weeds and management. So be sure to be here for that. In the meantime, take care. Have a great week. Thanks, everybody.